Hey everyone, welcome to the Funk Bed Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy. The views and opinions expressed by my guests in this podcast are not necessarily consistent with my own views and opinions. However, I do my best to be respectful of their views and opinions as they express them, even if they differ from my own. Now let's get to the podcast. Let me just start by saying that one of the things that I would like to accomplish in this part of the conversation, if I can, is to make sure we kind of have maybe two parallel discussions. It's always nice to give hope to healthcare consumers, people who are suffering from neurological symptoms or dysfunction, but also to try to inspire practitioners to commit some time and effort to learning about the brain. Because it's so critically important. And I think where we want to end up in the conversation, which is where we ended off last time, was talking about immunoception, the insular cortex, and some of the really cool work that you guys are doing based off the research that's out there. And I've spent some time brushing up on that just recently. So hopefully I sound like I know at least a little bit of what like I know what I'm talking about. But Rob, can you take just a second for anybody who might be tuning in to this episode that maybe missed the first one? Can you just do a quick recap of the Disconnected Kids book, the third edition? And you can just, keep it super quick, but just to ground people in maybe in the nuts and bolts of the first conversation that we had.
Sure. All right. So, just recently, the third edition of Disconnected Kids, which was, my primary book for general consumption. It was meant to be, an explanation to people as to what is actually happening in their child's brain, or maybe even a window into what happened to their brain as a child. Yeah. Because, again, it's all about brain development. And we know that 90%, if not more, of all adult mental health issues and many physical health issues really start in childhood, and it has to do with development. That book was first written as an explanation, but also a real hands-on manual to give people real tools to assess their child, to really be able to take that and put together an individualized home program, and then to lead them through the implementation of that program, at least at a pretty basic level. And Peter and I, throughout the years, it has been something that many practitioners, when they say, what do? I don't know what to do in my office. We often say, use that book and use it and go through the assessments and use that. So, it first came out in 2009, first edition. Then the second edition was about maybe 5-6 years ago or so. And the third edition just came out. The book is translated into 18 languages. It's more popular now than it's ever been. As a matter of fact, the last few years, it's really increased. That's why they asked me to do a third edition. And we've been doing a ton of research in my lab and with my group. We published 6 or 7 or 8 papers last year alone in some of the top journals in the world. And a lot of the new edition really includes a lot of that new research, new information. There's 2 new chapters on primitive reflexes and what they mean and how they work. And so, that book is out there now, and that's really a good place for people to start.
Yeah. Peter, with all the work that you've done with Rob over the years and the teaching that you do under the moniker of the Manila Method, can you travel back 5-10 years ago and could you at that point see where you would be today with where the research is and the clinical applications that you're doing? Could you have anticipated where you are?
Yeah, I do believe so. I mean, doing Rob's work for over 20 years, and obviously coming from the background that we've all come from as a chiropractic neurology background and our diplomate program that we all completed, you had that basis. And then when I met, Robert in 2004, and at the time he only had a 50-hour course just on 2 topics, or ADHD1 and ADH2. And it just kept evolving. Every 2 years he evolved the program. And then once we started actually doing the brain balance centers in 2007, Dr. Miller doesn't do anything without a plan, okay? And, there's a lot of people out there that talk about, setting goals and writing it down. I mean, I know this man does it. I know he does it at the end of the year, he sits down and he evaluates his achievements of his goals for that prior year, and then what's going next. And so I knew, when I first met him and when we spoke about even the possibilities of doing this program at the time, he said, "Hey, get back to me in a year or two. We're going to have something." And I went back to him, and there it was. And then when we actually started the centers, we had a 5-year goal, and then we had a 10-year goal. So I think that everything we've ever done, there's always been specific goals that have been set. So without a doubt, there was always, okay, let's get, could we duplicate his model? Could we duplicate what he was doing in his brain balance center in New York? Could I take it and duplicate it? And then could others take it and duplicate it? And we did that. And then the next thing was, okay, can we get all these reference ranges for all these children and normative data, and then be able to compare our results against normative data? And then we started publishing those type of papers. And then from there, we went into basic science papers and actually started doing, more original research other than just doing retrospective or prospective research studies.
Right.
So everything he's ever done and has always been with an intent behind it and a specific goal that was to do this, and then let's do this after we do this. And I know that what we're doing right now in the neuroimmunology of the developmental world that we're looking at right now, we were just together and working on outlines and groundwork of research papers, and then where we want to be even the next 12 months. So
yeah,
Steve, if I can jump in on that a second, because
please.
Peter's right. Obviously I have everything. I write things down. I have goals, and the way I run my practice, and we have yearly, monthly, weekly, daily goals for every department that all my staff knows. But the one thing I didn't anticipate 5 years ago was the level of expertise that Peter would bring in the immunology world, right? Because obviously I'm setting goals based on what I know my goals to be. And my goal, with Peter has always been to have him play even a bigger role in the teaching end of it. But, being an expert, a world-class expert in everything is very hard, right? You still have to focus. And so, where Peter has taken this and his level of work over the past 5 years has been really remarkable. And it's really, really been incredible to watch it. It reminds me of myself when I was, about the same age, where I really became like this passionate, obsessive, compulsive, wrote my textbook and, really decided that I was going to become a world-class at something. And I've seen that in him. And what he's been able to add in this area of immunology and really being able to educate me, but also be able to bring and help us bring the knowledge of the immune system with the brain and the nervous system at a level that, I wouldn't have anticipated, 5 or 6 years ago. So that for me has been a huge change in the positive. I mean, it's really lighted us to, and I think allowed us and me to bring this to a whole different level.
Yeah. Teamwork always is better. And I'm kind of fond of saying in the functional medicine seminars that I teach, because, we teach them under names like mastering this and mastering that. And, I think once you decide you're going to become an expert in this one thing, you automatically suck at everything else, because you have to ignore everything else to be really good at that one thing. And that might be a little bit of a stretch, but, I think you understand what I'm talking about. So here's a question for both of you guys. I would imagine that to the lay public, the brain is kind of a mysterious black box. Like, everyone knows they have a brain. Nobody really knows how it works, and you just almost take it for granted. But if we switch the conversation and focus on practitioners, it seems to me that universally across disciplines, the brain is not very well understood. So why do you guys think that so few healthcare practitioners on either side of the conventional or alternative fence, why do so many not understand the brain, particularly from a function standpoint, not necessarily from a pathology standpoint?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey guys, thanks for listening and being a loyal subscriber. Wanted to let you know about several important resources that you have available to you as listeners to the Inflammation Nation podcast. The first is my lab shop. The link is in the episode description, and this is a place where you can get access to the very same tests that I use in my clinical practice with all of my personal coaching clients. You don't need a prescription, and the system is set up so that my listeners can access quality labs at direct-to-lab pricing. The second resource is a list of learning courses that I offer for very reasonable prices through my main website. I have courses on gut health, detox, and several that are related to thyroid and Hashimoto's. If you're a true do-it-yourselfer, you need to check these out. They're consumer-friendly versions of the topics that I teach to doctors in my doctor-only functional medicine seminars. The link to the course list is also in the description. And finally, the third resource is me. Even though I'm involved in many different projects, I'm still accepting new clients. Having said that, I do limit the number of people I take on as clients every month so that I can give everyone the level of personal attention that they deserve. So if you have a health issue that you haven't been able to solve on your own or with your current provider team, you can use the link in the episode description or the contact form on my website to email me directly and let me know that you want to schedule an appointment. My initial consultation is an hour long, and it's designed to help me understand the scope and nature of your problems and to make sure that we're a good fit for each other. And finally, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and hit the notification bell so that you know when new episodes drop. Thanks for being a loyal listener, and now, back to the podcast.
I guess I'll jump in and start. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I always say that the most important organ that we all have is our brain, and it's the one that most people know the least about. You know more about your heart and your gut, and you know nothing about your brain. But also with practitioners, really very few practitioners really know anything functionally about the brain. Even neurologists, even neuropsychologists or psychologists. Most people don't realize that most psychologists have never had almost any neuroanatomy courses at all, like most zero. And I think one is because it's really hard and it's the most complicated thing, I think, to understand. And I also think because there's a bias in the traditional medical world towards the biochemistry and towards the chemical understanding. And that's not really the foundational way the brain works. It works really as a product of function, of actions, of sensory feedback, of cognitive skills, of, there's a physics that underlies the brain and the connectivity. And so most people are not exposed to that or don't understand that. And I think those two reasons are partly where I think there are very few people that really have any real working knowledge of the brain at all. And that's why I think there's so many misconceptions out there as well.
Right.
That most brain problems start in the gut and things like that, because of really a lack of knowledge of the brain.
Yeah. Peter, when you graduated with your basic science and DC degrees, did you come out of school thinking that you really understood the brain?
Well, I mean, I was actually a little bit lucky because while I was a student in chiropractic school, I got exposed to some people that were actually talking about the brain. I got exposed to the likes of Dan Murphy.
Yeah.
He turned me on to the likes of, obviously, our CARIC training that we all went through and so on. So, my last 2 years of my DC schooling, I was really wrapped into chiropractic neurology, functional neurology. And it also coincide with the CARIC Institute being born at that time in that early 2000s, and so for me it was a little bit different. But I would say for the vast majority of my colleagues that were in my quarter with me, that's not where their head was. And if I'd not gone in and done all those hours, those 300 plus hours of Diplomate and other seminars I did that were targeted towards the brain, no, I would have just had that basic science that would have passed my boards, and that would have been it, like most of the chiropractic community. But what I will just say is that I think what Dr. Malillo touched on was is one of the challenging factors for even the functional medicine, because the functional medicine world still looks at the brain, oh, okay, let's just do a supplement for the brain. Let's
Yep.
just do, green medicine for the most part. Is that, we're not going to, if we're not using pharmacology, we'll use some herb or something like that to influence some biochemistry. Where again, we're coming at it from a whole different perspective. We're talking about developmental neuroscience. We're talking about how does the brain develop longitudinally through these very specific steps? And if they don't go through these very specific steps, how does that alter the connectivity of the brain? And, and how do we see these functional disconnection syndromes, not only in the childhood world, but we see it in the adult world?
Yeah, and that kind of teases another question. And Rob, you said this, that a lot of adult neurological disorders have their root in poor development.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you marry that with just a general lack of understanding on the intervention side, conventional medicine, you end up with a heavy emphasis on either psychotherapy or pharmacy, right? Neurotransmitter reuptake inhibitors, that kind of stuff. If we focus in on function, because you mentioned it and then we kind of went on to some other things, you talked about how the brain develops as a result of action. Talk about that piece a little bit more, because, I've quite often said when I've taught, say, brain chemistry courses, I've often said that like movement is nutrition for the brain. The brain is that organ with which we experience life. It's how we go out and explore the environment, understand the environment, what allows us to appreciate art, understand humor. Pretty much everything that makes life worthwhile happens in the brain. So when you said that the brain develops as a result of action, tease that out for me, dive into a little bit more detail. What does that really mean to the layperson and then to the practitioner?
Yeah, no, it's great. Great question. Great that you pointed out, because this is actually so important. We talk about biochemistry and chemical interactions, and it definitely has an impact on biasing the brain and can have an impact on behavior, but it doesn't change the brain. It temporarily may modify it in a way, but it doesn't change it. That's why most medication or supplements don't have any neuroplasticity that they create. So it's like, I kind of use the example that the muscle is like, the brain is like your muscles, right? You're taking vitamins, taking supplements, even taking steroids might change your muscle tone a little bit or whatever. But unless you're exercising and unless you're doing something specific, and you need to do specific training. If I want to work on my right bicep, I need to do right bicep exercises, and I need to do resistance training. Doing aerobic exercise or lifting with my left arm is not going to work on my right arm. And the brain is all about doing things. And we know that the reason why we have brains to begin with on this planet, the first brain evolved because a living thing moved. It's basic understanding that living things that don't move don't have brains. And so movement is what initiated the necessity for a brain. And the more we move and the more complex we move, in neuroscience, there's a saying, simple movement, simple brain, complex movement, complex brain. Humans have the most complex movement, one with bipedalism, and then speech. Those two things are unique to humans, and we have by far the most complex brain. We also have by far the most asymmetric brain. Those things are related to one another. So, we have to actually do things. There's areas of the brain that process light and sound, and we need light and sound to change those areas. And if we use light and sound at specific frequencies, we can literally physically change the brain. Cognitively, we need to use attention or reading or doing math or, doing social skills. We have to do those things to build them. We have to do specific motor acts to change our brain in specific motor areas. Taking a pill isn't going to enhance our motor cortex or change it or change the connectivity in our brain. And that's basically the beauty of the brain. It's such a living, dynamic organ. It's so adaptable. And, if you learn something new, within 1 hour, we can literally measure physical changes in the brain. But if you take a pill, it doesn't work that way. If you take a supplement, it doesn't work that way. If you modify your diet, it doesn't change the brain. So when we talk about literally changing the brain, it's the difference between doing physical rehab for an injury, right? Where you can actually change it and you can work on it and you can be really specific to that modality and that action and that type of movement versus just taking a pain medication, which may reduce the pain and may, make you a little bit more flexible or whatever, but you're not really changing the motor system. You're not changing the way your muscles react. You're not changing, the endurance and so the brain requires specific actions, experience, movement, and you need to do it very specifically. And the right and left brain require different types of stimulus to actually change them. But that literally does change the brain. It changes the genetics. It changes genetic expression. It creates rewiring. It can even create new brain cells. And so most people have no idea about that because that's not how the traditional MD is trained. They're not trained on those things. And, even though you have people doing things like OT and PT and whatever that may actually change the brain, they don't really understand it. They don't know how they're changing the brain. Yeah. They're just doing things to try to improve or enhance a skill, but without any specific direction.
Yeah, they know if we do this, then we usually get a positive outcome. And so we'll just keep doing that.
Right.
Even though, like you said, they don't necessarily understand it. Peter, Rob mentioned asymmetry in the brain, that the more complex brains are, they have this element of asymmetry. I thought balance was what we were after. And I'm kind of being a little facetious with my question. But my understanding, if you can clarify for me, is that there are some functions that are by design lateralized, and there's a purpose for that. Can you comment on that we don't always want exactly the same thing happening on both sides of the brain?
Yeah, well, the way the brain has been designed, and through what Dr. Knoll is talking about, this epigenetic expression, these sensory stimulations that are going into the brain, firing these different receptors that then begin to build these different connections, different sound or different light frequencies are activating receptors in, like, say, the occipital cortex or the temporal lobe or the, let's say, the frontal lobe. So we have this stimulation that comes in, begins to drive these different expressions of different parts of the brain. And within those different parts of the brain, they begin to develop a level of functionality that is different. And then the right brain may have a more bias in, let's say, visual skills of visual spatial areas, where the left brain visually might have more of like a detail relationship. So, you're getting these different sensory stimulations that are coming in early on in the womb and then early developmentally through the first, let's say, 12 to 36 months of life, that really start explaining these shifts in brain. And one of the things that Dr. Knoll did a tremendous job on with his son about a year ago, they wrote a paper on, how does the brain actually lateralize? And there's actually even some thought that there is some genes that are there that are specifically coding for this lateralization, because we don't only see it in humans, but we also know that other animals like birds and other mammals have very clear lateralization aspects. So there is a certain level of probably this genetic expression that happens based on the sensory stimulation that allows for this level of connectivity to happen in one region of the brain that then dictates that particular functional skill of that particular side of the brain. Okay. So, and again, not to have, you don't want redundancy. We're not looking for redundancy in the brain. Okay.
That's it.
So
right.
that's really ultimately what we're looking at, is that that we know that for the most part that, there might be certain things that can happen in one side of the brain that's very specific, and there might be a little bit of that in the right side, but the dominancy of it is to one side. And again, the reality of it is that we're not looking for redundancy. It allows us to have this greater timing mechanism that exists between two sides of the brain and gives us just a greater degree of computation power.
Yeah, that's a great way of doing it. That was a really good question, Steve, actually, because, even just thinking about that, you hear, we talk about wanting balance. And so people think, well, doesn't that mean that both sides of the brain might be the same? And you're exactly right. I didn't even really think about it that way. But, we want the brain to be balanced from a maturity standpoint. We want physical growth. We want the underlying oscillations and the speed of processing. We want that to be balanced so that they can talk one another. But as Peter just said, we don't want both sides to do exactly the same thing, because that would be a waste of space. We don't want redundancy. We want them to clearly do different things so that we have literally two brains in one.
Yeah.
But we need to be able to have them communicate and talk to one another. And to do that, the speed of processing and the maturity of the brain needs to be balanced. And so that's the distinction there. But a really good question.
And that's a great point, because Steve, the idea that, for example, one of the common tools that we use in our assessment process and also rehabilitation process is the interactive metronome. And it's probably the one piece of technology that Robert and I have always felt like is just this amazing piece of technology that we can use to determine processing speed of the brain. Okay.
And change it.
And change it too. Because we can look at this timing aspect, and we're able to really look at this timing mechanism that is existing between the cerebellum, more specifically the inferior olive part of the brainstem, then communicating to the motor cortex and the frontal lobe. And when a patient is on this technology and they're hearing a steady repetition of a beat, just clapping or in their ear, and then they have to do a motor action to it, we can measure that in this very finite millisecond relationship. And again, knowing that the brain is operating on maybe on a slow level of millisecond, but even much faster than that. But the technology does allow us to say, okay, if the child or the adult is way off, their processing speed is dramatically slow. And then as we actually start rehabbing their brain and changing the way their brain is developing from an imbalanced way, we actually can see their processing speed get faster. And the closer and closer they actually get to the normative data that's been developed by the utilization of this technology, is that their brain begins to actually have a more whole timing mechanism. And what's fascinating is that when we do the initial evaluation, sometimes we can see a timing difference in the left hemisphere compared to the right hemisphere that's 10 times, 20 times, 30 times difference in the timing mechanism. And then as we do, and really where we studied this the most was actually when we did our Harvard study with McLean Hospital, because that was probably the single largest modality that they used in that study was the interactive metronome, and having the patient population in that ADHD group do a tremendous amount of work on it. And what we were able to show was how we begin to integrate areas of the brain, begin to take out the disturbance that was happening from the lower part of the brain to the upper part of the brain, and then also see that we created the top-down regulation that we needed to happen. But it happened really because of the timing activity that occurred in the lower part of the brain, and obviously the hemispheric influence that we had when we were using that therapy.
Yeah. Back to this idea of laterality or imbalance. It seems to me that we expect to have a little bit of asymmetry, not necessarily in function, where something might be completely lateralized, like language, for example, housed in generally the left brain. But it seems to me that a little bit of asymmetry between right brain and left brain within tolerable limits is just part of who we are. It's just part of personality, right? So we might know somebody who we go, okay, that person is really left brain. They're very scientific. They're the engineer type. And then the right brain is more the artistic, make love, not war type person. And so we kind of expect that within tolerable limits to just be part of the diversity of humanity. But obviously there's a threshold where the asymmetry exceeds that tolerable limit. And then we start running into problems. And so in the book, and I know in the work that you're part of, Peter, you guys talk about left brain dominance, right brain dominance, and And I guess I should point out that, for example, the left brain dominance might come as a result of increased left brain activity, or probably more commonly a decreased right brain, because there's the word balancing, and there has to be some balance. So the tendency is for, if one brain side of the brain doesn't work as well or as efficiently, the other one becomes dominant because there's a deficiency. So how is it, like, the average person who's listening here, even practitioners, and they're going like, okay, well, I am bent a certain way, I'm more artsy, I'm more scientific. How would they look at themselves or look at someone they love and care about and think to themselves, whatever asymmetry is going on might be beyond the tolerable limits? Like, what are the, and maybe we can talk about kids and then adults. What are the early warning signs that there is an asymmetry that is beyond the tolerable limit that we might be concerned about and take some action on?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, I think, the way to look at asymmetry in the brain from a natural standpoint, I believe that we're all a little right brain or left brain dominant. And that's what we call cognitive style. It's just like being right-handed or left-handed, and there's nothing wrong with either one. One isn't better than the other. It just is. And they're built on a trait, right? If your parents are right-handed, you're supposed to be right-handed, but you may end up being left-handed, and that is not the way it's supposed to be. So that could be more reflective of an issue, right, during development. And all of this, really, all of it is a byproduct of the developmental growth of the brain. So that what we see is that if there is, your natural strengths and weaknesses, if one side of the brain or the other takes too much of a dominance during growth and development, it may come online too early, and it may hold back the other brain. So really, it's a matter of a maturational imbalance, maturity imbalance, and that also ends up with an activation imbalance. But the bottom line is, when somebody is not able to function in a normal realm, right? Like if a child isn't able to learn properly, they're not able to read the way they're supposed to, or they're not socializing like they should, or they're not behaving like they should, or there's all of these different immune dysregulations, that's when it may fall to the point of, okay, we need to intervene. But like we say all the time, the people that are most gifted in an area of the brain, because basically when someone is gifted or talented or intelligent, what does that mean? It means that certain areas of their brain are stronger than most people, meaning they're faster, they process information, they have stronger connections. And as you get stronger in one area, you're a little bit weaker in the other area. And that's normal, right? That's an advantage. And that advantage may be really good for a while. But when you cross a certain threshold, the disadvantage outweighs the advantage. The analogy that I use, and that was used in a really great article that I read, is that if you have, like, let's say you're breeding for a fast racehorse, you will breed for longer, thinner legs. So they get longer, thinner legs. They get faster and faster and faster and faster for each generation. And that's a good thing. That's an advantage. It's an advantage to them in many ways. But at a certain point, the leg becomes so long and thin that as soon as they start to run, they break their leg. And now it's not an advantage anymore.
Yeah.
And that's why even, traits and even issues like autism and schizophrenia and bipolar, even though they actually reduce evolutionary fitness, they reduce the chance of having children, they are actually increasing dramatically through society, because at a lower level of concentration, they give great advantage, especially for our modern society, which is driving more and more towards a left brain world, right? So it's a matter of looking at these traits and looking at, the way that the brain is going to grow and develop superimposed on what we do well and what's in our family. And that's why you talk about some families, they might be better in musical type things, or they might be all engineers, or they might, be all, artists of one level. And these are things that run in families. But, that's kind of the way to look at it, rather than, as some, we're not saying that everybody should be perfectly balanced. Having, we know that there's a benefit to having diversity in the world, right? Yeah. But so we want people to have different strengths and weaknesses, and in a group that makes it good. That increases your survival. If everybody's good at one thing and everybody's bad at one thing, that group isn't going to survive very long, right? So diversity is good, but too much diversity or too much asymmetry in the brain, then the weaknesses outweigh the strengths, and then it becomes a disability.
So Peter, would like thinking about developing kids, like give me something specific if you can. What would be the first sign? Like this is top of mind for me because I just had a grandchild born a month ago tomorrow. And I just thankfully I just had a chance to spend 3 or 4 days with them in South Carolina and hold them and get to know them. So thinking about parents with newborns or parents with infants who might be, 3, 4, 6 months old, what would be the first sign that would alert them to their baby has got a developmental delay?
Well, I mean, I think we first want to look at, was the child a vaginal delivery or cesarean? Okay, because if they were cesarean, then there's a greater probability that the primitive reflexes are probably not going to go through their longitude. Okay.
All right, let me just pause you there for a second. As we mentioned primitive reflexes in our last conversation, we never really got into it. It's a big topic of the book, obviously, and I don't know all the ins and outs of the Melilla method, but I know that primitive reflex remediation, like identifying retained primitive reflexes, is important, and even in the adult population, right? You can have these things come back as a result of injury, for example, or just aging. So let's just pause, if you don't mind. Let's define what a primitive reflex is and why these are important, not from just a developmental standpoint in the infant and child, but to an adult who may be suffering from anxiety, depression, motor disorders, anything that you could list as an adult neurological manifestation.
Well, let's just break down the word. Primitive meaning that it's there initially. It's almost like an innate response. Okay, it's a stereotypical response of the central nervous system at the moment of during gestation. Okay, because you do have them appear at certain gestational weeks. Okay, and they come online, and again, they are just these very stereotypical functions of the central nervous system, because again, when the baby is born, there's really not this really big brain that they have. They're really relying on mostly their brainstem at that moment, okay, and where the primitive reflexes are housed or in the brainstem. So they're doing these very specific reflexive functions based on movement, okay, movement of the body and the head in space and the limbs, and especially the head, and as it moves, as the spine, if the head rotates, for example, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex is a reflex that starts early on in gestation, and upon head movement will cause a head arm extension on that one side, and the opposite side a flexion movement of the arm. So you have these very stereotypical functions, reflexes that are happening in the womb. There are several of them that are designed to assist with the birthing process. Okay, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, the symmetrical tonic neck reflex, the spinal galant reflex. So these are reflexes that actually allow the baby to actually move and twist themselves through the birth canal. And then they actually set up the staging of then the next primitive reflexes that are happening immediately after birth, and so on. And so what has to happen normally is that the child goes through these different stages of the reflex being active for a certain period of time, maybe a 3-month window, and then they release and they give way to another set of primitive reflexes. And then we move to postural reflexes, and the postural reflexes are the reflexes that actually allow the infant to go upright, okay? And then obviously eventually go through the stages of crawling and into walking, okay? Now, and so right off the bat, if the child doesn't go through the birth canal, there may be an alteration of how that sequence happened. Okay, so that would be first. And one of the most important reflexes that we have is the reflex that has to do with latching onto the breast. Okay, so the rooting reflex. So right off the bat, if a mother wants to breastfeed, the child may not latch. completely. So if there is a relationship there where they're not latching, then you need to maybe see if the rooting reflex is not even actually happening. Okay. And then at that point, is there some level of muscle tone that might be also there, a lack of muscle tone that's contributing that? So we might, in that case, have to activate the rooting reflex to allow the child to suck. So that would be immediately. I mean, immediately, right within the first hours of birth, to kind of see whether or not. There's also a palmar grasp reflex that should happen right away. So if the mom or anyone goes to touch the palm of the hand and they don't grasp something, then that might be, again, another sign that these reflexes are not on. Okay, so that would be immediately. And then, as we talk about in the book, there is these basically like 11 primary reflexes. There are others, but 11 primary ones that we really assess that we would like to see being assessed immediately through a standard pediatric neurological exam. Now, this was done 30 years ago. Okay, I mean, Rob shows in his course that there was textbooks that outlined this, and pediatricians would do this, but they got away from it. Okay, and it's not like the OTs or PTs that are maybe trained in this. They're not seeing a child in that early 3 months or 6 months level. So we got to get back to teaching that as a primary part of a normal pediatric exam, so we can actually see that the children are actually going through these stages of maturation. Because if they're retained, and they're retained beyond the 12-month mark, 15-month mark, and 18-month, then we know we have a delay in maturation. We may not yet know exactly which hemisphere is beginning to be the immature hemisphere, but we definitely can say that, hey, the child is having delay. Now, as Dr. Malone said, the traits of the parents or the grandparents may give us bias also into which hemisphere may be beginning to become more faster growing and the other one being delayed. For example, we know that if the left hemisphere turns on very early, we may see very early language skills arise. We may see children at 16, 18 months actually begin to develop a very sophisticated language. Okay. And so right off the bat, if that happens, then there's probably a good indication that the left hemisphere is developing more rapidly, and we're going to see further suppression of that right brain. Obviously, muscle tone and is a big issue there. So, I mean, those would be the early signs right off the bat.
Yeah. So you described some of these reflexes as aiding in the birth process, and then the rooting and suckling reflex. I mean, that's kind of a survival thing, right?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
You brush the cheek and the baby will turn and open its mouth. Anybody who has had a child or even has been around a newborn knows that it's just a flurry of spastic, spontaneous movement, right? There's no sophistication. The eyes are roaming. They don't really have much control of their core, their head, and that develops just simply within a matter of weeks. They begin to orient their eyes and maybe turn their head with a little bit of control.
But that's because those reflexes there, okay? Those
reflexes. And this is why what I was thinking about is that with all the spastic movements of arms and legs, which is very discoordinated, right? Because that system hasn't developed yet. It seems to me that almost serves like a wind-up mechanism to put input into the brain to allow it to develop. And as the brain develops as a result of all the spontaneous reflexive movements, it learns to control those things. And now we see the abolishment of the things that allowed the brain to develop. And so when you talk about retained primitive reflexes, it's primitive reflexes that somebody had that didn't go away because that connection between the reflexive movement and brain development didn't happen the way that it should have. Am I on track with that, Rob?
Yeah, essentially, as we said, these reflexes are there because human babies are the most immature babies of any animal in the animal kingdom, right? I mean, every other baby can get up and run away or do things. As you said, they can move their body. Yeah. And then again, we said movement was the key to brain development. It's why we have brains. It's the key to brain development. Anything that alters that from normal development is going to have a major impact on the brain. And so, even from the very beginning, if a mom has a problem where the baby is in a breech position, the baby is designed with these reflexes to get themselves into that position.
Yeah.
If they don't get into that position, you have to ask why. And it's usually because already there's a motor issue with the baby, that they can't move and they can't activate the reflexes, or they have lower tone. As Peter was saying, 80, 85, 90% of the kids that we work with, they never latched on appropriately in the first few days or few weeks, some not at all. So there's already an alteration of muscle tone. And so the way it works is that, we're born with these reflexes because we don't have any control. We have no volitional control over our movements. It's all random and chaotic at that point, as you're saying. And the reflexes at least give some control, so that you said we can survive, we can feed ourselves, we can do basic things. And then they should lead us through and get us to move. And as we move, we engage those senses. And then those senses, as you alluded to, give feedback to the brain, activate the genes called experience-dependent genes that then cause our brain to mature and grow and get more connections and bring more coordination and more control. And the brain literally builds from the bottom up. It starts in the brainstem, which is the foundation of our brain. That's where the reflexes come from. And then that, as we move and we go through the world and we increase that feedback and we engage our senses, and it builds a more complex brain, which then allows for more control and complex movement that then increases more feedback, that creates another stage of complexity and allows for more complex movement. And then all of this is calibrating our brain to the world around us, because a lot of our software is already there, but we need to calibrate it to the world around us so that it makes sense and we can use it at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. And that process is very specific. And the right brain takes the lead for the first 3 years and builds more in the right brain. And then the left brain kicks in for the next 3 years. And then they should catch up to one another at 6 years or so. And then they should be lateralized and integrated. And that's the way it should develop. Anything that alters that is going to have an impact on that development and make things come on too early or too strong, or things delayed in their development. And then that sets up this asymmetry. And that's where all the symptoms come from, is from that asymmetry and its impact on the body, on the digestive system, on the immune system, and all of that.
Yeah. You just described a well-designed and guided process. Like, it just struck me as you were speaking that, like we just talked about with the primitive reflexes, designed to support the birthing process and then survival immediately, and then begin the early developmental stages of the brain. And because the right brain is, obviously it does many things, but part of it is awareness of self, right? It just struck me that because the right brain is more awareness of self, left brain is awareness of your external environment and seeking behavior. It would seem to be completely inappropriate if the left brain developed first, right?
Exactly.
And so you have an infant or a child who has very little understanding of self, who just gets out in the world and explores. The child could get themselves into trouble pretty easily.
Absolutely. And they may get early verbal skills. Like Peter said, we get kids that can read. I had one kid from the UK that could read at 8 months old.
Wow.
So no one should read at that point. And the right brain, Ian McGilchrist, we love him because he's so eloquent in his writing, and, he's a psychiatrist out of the UK, and he's done such beautiful descriptions. And he talks about how the right brain should be the master. I talk about how the right brain should be the dominant one. And as the left brain comes online, the left brain is hyperactive and impulsive and aggressive and doesn't really care about people so much and isn't really connected to our body and doesn't care about the environment. It cares about facts. It cares about details. It cares about, goals and seeking and accumulating things and all of these things that are good and necessary, but, aren't altruistic and aren't really, aren't social and aren't about emotional regulation. And so the right brain should act almost like the parent always through most of our life. The right brain is the wise brain. The left brain has the information, but the right brain is the wise. Like, why do we use that? And how do we do it? And the right brain is even more intelligent than the left brain. And it's gotten a bad rap in the years, but the right brain synthesizes a ton of information instantaneously, subconsciously, and is aware and knows things and, sees beauty and, understands things without things that you can't really describe in words.
Yeah.
And the left brain slows it down and is slower and really kind of less intelligent, even though we think of it as the intellectual brain and the dominant brain and the language brain. But just because it has a voice doesn't mean it's smarter, right?
Yeah.
Just because it has a memory doesn't mean it's smarter. And so, you're exactly right. And that is autism, where the right brain is delayed in its development because these reflexes aren't going away and other factors. That left brain comes online too early because they're naturally gifted, and now it dominates over the right. And now that is a bad situation, and that gets worse as time goes on. And we literally have kids that are non-speaking that can type on letterboards and tell us that there's this raging battle between the left and the right brain, where the left brain doesn't want to give up its dominance because it's essentially a control freak.
Yeah, we'll eventually have to bring the conversation to like some of the things that you guys are doing in clinic to change that. Rob,
Steve, can I jump in one moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I have a question for you.
So back to something we said earlier, but also Dr. Miller just brought it up. And again, you guys were alluding to like kind of when is that breaking point, right? And how do we see that breaking point in this asymmetrical distribution? I think this is one of the things that we see in the diagnostic continuum that we often see with the children that present to our office, okay, where, let's say a 10-year-old child or a 12-year-old child presents to either one of our practices, and you do the history workup on them. And the parent may easily say, yeah, my child was very verbal early on in development, okay, around that 2.5-year-old, 3-year-old mark, and developed almost like a professor syndrome type of thing. The kids had this very high vocabulary. And then when they go to elementary, they go to preschool or pre-K or kindergarten, they do okay, but they're initially maybe being described as inattentive or maybe more so hyperactive or impulsive, okay, or they may even show some signs of STEM behavior where obviously they have these very repetitive behaviors that they're doing, maybe with their hands or their body, or maybe even verbal stems, or something like that. And usually what happens is that, as Dr. Mo alluded to, the idea that the two sides of the brain are going through these developmental shifts, okay? And that when that left brain that or shouldn't really have turned on to maybe about 2.5, going into like that 3 to 6 year window, okay? Because the first 3 years is the right. But usually around that 4, 5, and 6-year-old level, if the left hemisphere already was developing too rapidly in those first 3 years, we get a major bump then, okay? As they're beginning to enter like maybe first grade, or transitioning maybe now getting up a little bit higher in the second grade. So this is usually what we see diagnostically, where all of a sudden it went from like, let's say maybe like an ADHD diagnosis to now they go to their pediatrician, and the pediatrician is saying, well, not only does your child have ADHD, but your child has like a motor tics, okay, or maybe even showing some Tourette-like symptoms, or worse, maybe even showing some obsessive compulsive types. And so I think that that's where we see it. And so unfortunately, what happens in the medical model is this. The child maybe went on their ADHD medication, okay, early on. But now, okay, we need to add such and such medication in to control the motor tics. Or we need such and such medication now to control the obsessive compulsive aspect. Or how about anxiety? I can't tell you how many times over the years where we've seen children that have anxiety with flushing the toilet bowl, okay? Or they develop a STEM behavior around flushing the toilet bowl, okay? So I think that that's when you begin to see these changes, where you see changes in functionality, where that left brain is going further and further in terms of its functionality, but at the same time as it's going up, it's really inhibiting that left brain. So we don't see the self-regulation that we would normally see. We don't see the maturation of their social engagement system. We don't see the maturation of their right brain emotions, that the further development of that interoceptive, that theory of mind.
Yeah. Rob, in one of the past answers or little monologues that you blessed us with, you use the phrase experience gene. And I remember back when I did my neurology diplomate, we used to talk about how 60% of the brain was hardwired, right? These are neurological tracks that are the same between you and me and Peter and everybody else. And roughly 40% was developmental and was unique to the individual. Have those numbers or those concepts changed at all?
I would say that there's probably more than 60% that's actually developmental, because even the hardwired part is still dependent on gene expression, formation of networks and where things are supposed to form. And all of that is really more, again, experience dependent. Give you an example. We know that the thalamus is the area that all our sensory input goes in and goes into the brain. It's the main relay. Yeah. And there are two main nuclei. One is the main relay for any auditory information coming in, and that goes up into the temporal lobe. And then we know that there's another one that is all the visual input comes in, and that goes to the back of the brain. Well, a few years ago, there were some studies where they changed the input, and they took all the auditory input and they put it into the nuclei that normally would get hearing, and they switched them. And what happens is the back of the brain became the hearing brain and the side of the brain became the visual brain, meaning that back of the brain is not hardwired to be a visual cortex. It's made that way by the input that goes in there. And that can be changed if you change that input. So that shows that the hardwiring that we supposedly have in our brain is really not that hardwired and is also experience dependent. So it's a lot more malleable, and, things can go wrong, in a big way. But the good news is we can also change it in a big way pretty rapidly and pretty quickly by just knowing how the system works and being able to use that to our advantage. So there's almost none of these issues that can't be changed, and the idea that, okay, once you have this, these are lifelong problems that can never be. To me, that's complete BS, because first of all, if you know anything about the brain, that's not the way the brain works. We can change it. It's not like baking a cake. We made a cake. Oh, we forgot the eggs. We can't go back and put eggs in now. But the brain, we can do that because it remakes itself and it can change, and it's a living organism. And you put new input in and it completely can reshape itself.
Yeah, and that even within our group of functional neurologists, I remember the notion, and in fact, I've heard other people use that baking a cake analogy, that once you've baked a cake, you've got a cake. It can't become anything else. And so I get, and this leads into one of the questions I was going to ask you is like, once someone develops an asymmetry as a child, at what age does it become, I was going to use the word impossible, but I'll refrain from that. At what point or under what circumstance does it become more difficult to introduce changes that will, for lack of a better way of saying it, rebalance those asymmetries?
Yeah, that really is, from a standpoint of neuroplasticity, or the ability to actually change the brain, we never lose that. Even when you're 80 years old, we can change it. But the only limiting factor that I've found is that when a kid becomes a certain age, we need to get them to do physical exercises. We need to make an effort to do things, because as we said, changing the brain requires action. It requires doing something. We can do a lot of it passively initially, but at a certain point, they have to be a part of it. And at a certain point, what you may get are people that are, kids that may be very violent or aggressive and may be very resistant to allowing any of that to be done, or even as an adult, where there's such an imbalance, such a lack of self-awareness or a lack of motivation that they just can't get themselves to do it, or they're completely resistant, or they refuse any sort of treatment. And that's really the only limiting factor as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's just the willing to participate and take ownership of that process, which is difficult. Like even, especially if you have kids that have that decreased right brain function, they lack that wisdom, right? They lack the context. They can't necessarily project into the future and understand the consequences of not doing what it is they really should do. Right.
Exactly.
And that, unfortunately, I'm speaking to parents out there, like my heart breaks for parents of children who have these issues, and the parents know it and they desperately want them to engage, but they just simply refuse. And you can, as the old saying goes, lead a horse to water.
And a lot of it is really how you explain it to people too. I have a 30-something-year-old man today that came in who's severely depressed, suicidal, and has a lot of other issues like immune issues, and had chronic Lyme's disease, and then COVID hit and depression hit him really badly. And, he is just feels like I'll never get rid of the Lyme's. I'll never be able to get over this. And it's hopeless. And that's what his brain is telling them. And so I spent a lot of time talking to him about how all of this is neurological. Everything you're feeling, everything is because of these imbalances in your system. And, and afterwards he said, thank you for explaining that to me. I would have never thought of any of that. And I just thought, like, I'm a hopeless case. I went to every doctor and went to all these people and nobody could help me. And so I'm thinking that maybe it's best for me to just check out of this world. And, you just explained it to me where it's not my fault and I'm not a bad person and I'm not weak and I'm not broken. I just have to be able to find somebody that can show me how to do this.
Yeah. It's something that's happened to me rather than who I am.
Right.
Yeah. Peter, how many times in consulting with adults have you heard someone who blames all of their symptoms, say, "Oh, it's my hormones," or it's my this, it's my that, and the one thing that they're leaving out of the equation is all of these things have their impact not solely on the brain, but it's a key part of that. So it kind of begs the question, and maybe the question or the answer is in the question, but why is brain health and function so important? And should we prioritize that, not to the exclusion of, but should we prioritize the brain over things like the endocrine system or hormones, or even over the immune system or over gut health? Should we prioritize that in our thought process? Doesn't mean we ignore everything else, but should we put the brain at the pinnacle?
I do believe that. I believe that's what we've been seeing for many years. I mean, I've been in and out of working with kids and adults, over the last, especially over the last decade, when I left, full time working with children. And I've seen patients go, to come into my office and they've been around the merry-go-round of functional medicine and conventional medicine. And when you actually probably really drill down to a lot of their core issues, in my opinion, it probably stems from a brain asymmetry, that they have a brain imbalance that's happened. And I think you're getting a greater magnitude. One of the other things that I think is important when you're working with adults, and this is something that Dr. Noel spends a great deal in his courses talking about, is adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Okay, so, when you get into that population of working with 20, 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old people, and even in the 60th decade of life, one of the things that we do have them do is score an ACEs checklist, okay? Because you need to be on alarm for that, because, and especially when you're also doing your metabolic work upon them, and the way our questionnaires are set up is to really try to go back as far as the patient can remember about their health history. You can begin to see where certain things going on maybe in their teenage years, maybe they don't remember, the adult doesn't remember back to their elementary years, but you begin to get a sense that, there was a brain asymmetry. Like I have a gentleman that reached out to me recently, who again had gone to a lot of different functional medicine practitioners. And after I did his intake, it clearly showed up that he had a very left brain dominancy. That he really was this very, strong engineer type of person, and that he was developing this really, great social anxiety, and then he was having It was impacting his relationship with his wife for, many of decades at this point. And so again, he was looking for something different. He didn't want me to just say, hey, take this supplement or
Right.
let me run this lab. He had all
Yeah.
this stuff. And, he said, okay, what you're telling me makes sense. And the further that we went into his history, it was very clear from a very early age that this man, even in his 70s, had a very clear left brain dominancy. And so he felt very relieved after I explained that to him, and that he got a hold of the book and read the book, and he's like, oh man, this explains me when I was 10 years old, explains me when I was 20 years old, and so on. So it's always nice when you can give that patient a different approach that says, hey, this is probably more brain centric, and everything from there is just a downstream issue to this brain hemispheric imbalance.
Yep.
And I think that's what Rob and I are really trying to do, to shake up the whole functional medicine world. That the functional medicine world has become so compartmentalized. You have your as the T says, your green medicine guys, you have your methylators, you have your these genomic people, and everybody. And part of a lot of it, I think, is influenced by all the lab companies that are out there,
Sure,
that are driving people to do it this way or that way. But they've got away from looking at a central mechanism, and obviously we believe that the central mechanism is imbalance.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's probably a good segue into interoception and the insular cortex. And we've been talking in general terms about left brain and right brain. And Rob, you mentioned the thalamus, and Peter, you talked about, I think you mentioned the cerebellum, and there's all these different structures and substructures in the brain. But, if we say left brain, that includes the left frontal lobe, the left parietal lobe, the left temporal lobe, and structures that are deeper to that. And I do this all the time. In fact, I'm traveling to California in November to teach our mastering brain chemistry class. And one of the first things I do is I have people take out a piece of paper and ask them to draw a side view of the brain and label the lobes of the brain and just one or two things that those parts of the brain do. And the only people who can actually do that with any proficiency are people who have taken the course before, or maybe it's a functional neurologist or a chiropractic neurologist that's taken functional medicine course. And that just underlies that we don't teach medical chiropractic acupuncture students. We don't teach them about the brain, certainly not from a function standpoint. Having said that, most docs would probably fail to name the insular cortex as a part of the cortex. And I know that that's a somewhat recent classification, or maybe reclassification, that it's, considered its own, I guess, lobe of the brain in addition. But it's a fascinating structure. So much is going on there. And I know, Rob, that you have placed a lot of emphasis of your own learning and study, and a lot of the work, Peter, that you're doing with the immune system and bringing that in gets to a subcomponent of interoception, which is this thing called immunoception. So let's start with the big picture stuff first. What is the insular cortex? What does it do? Why is that important? And either one of you can take that.
Yeah, so when a child is born, obviously from a survival perspective, and remember, the right brain comes online first, and the first job it has is to keep us alive, right?
Yeah.
So that means that we need to be able to non-verbally communicate to our parents or caregivers that we're in pain, that we're hot, that we're cold, that we're hungry, that we're thirsty, that we have to be changed. And smell and taste are very involved with that, right? So that's online right from the beginning as a key survival. And to be able to somehow allow our parents or caregivers to understand that. That all happens in the right brain, in that right insula primarily. And so this is what we call interoception. So it is really critical to survival that we have these basic senses that we can perceive and that we can communicate in some way. Yep. But then built on top of that are feelings, emotions, cognitive abilities, especially the ability to socialize, because the number one key to survival for humans is we must get along with other people. We must actually be part of a group. You couldn't be in the Stone Age and be by yourself for any length of time without being killed. Or if you were kicked out of a group because you didn't get along, it was a death sentence. So again, that hardwired for survival should be our drive to attach to other humans. And so right from the beginning, we should attach to our parents, and then time from a little baby in the crawling, they should want to be with other children and approach other children and play with them like little puppies and play with each other and learn how to read social cues and mostly non-verbally interacting with one another. And that forms the foundation of social emotional connections and emotional regulation, which is really the foundation of that wisdom of the brain and self-awareness and becoming embodied, where at about 2 years of age, a child recognizes themselves in the mirror and for the first time says, oh, that's me. That's separate individual. I own this body. This is me. And then after that, shortly after that, they can then start to have agency, meaning I can control my actions and I can have, cause an effect on the world around me. And that's really important. And so what we see is that in kids with autism in particular is a model in where I study, we see that is greatly impacted, where they often have, very, very low or almost absent interoception early on, which tells us that right brain is delayed. They don't have a drive to connect to other children. They don't become embodied. They don't ever really get ownership. And then that left brain comes online and they don't get agency. So that left brain is doing things kind of randomly, haphazardly. They're stimming and they're moving and they're doing all these things and they're having outbursts and their immune system is out of control and they're not in control. They don't feel their body. They can't control their body. And they know, on the other hand, though, that all their words are there. They're smarter than other people around them. They know all of that, but they can't show it and they can't say it. And that's been one of my main areas of research that's taken me 30 years to get here. Why don't they speak? No one's ever explained that. And I think that understanding the insula and interoception, that's why they don't speak. They don't feel their tongue. They don't feel their body. They can't control it. And speech is the most complex motor act. And without having complete being embodied, you can't control that. So, this is why that insula, in particular, the right insula, is so important to this.
Is it fair to say that the insular cortex develops prior to the frontal lobe, temporal and parietal lobes?
Yeah, sure. If we look at the brain as growing from the bottom up and from the inside out, the insula, if you cut away, the surface of the neocortex and pull it away, underneath that, still part of the cortex, but underneath the mail layer is the insula. So it forms the inside part of the brain and really borders on the frontal lobe. So that, again, self-awareness and also empathy, theory of mind, what Peter said, being able to understand what other people are feeling non-verbally. The temporal lobe, it borders, so smell and taste and emotions are there. And also the parietal lobe, where we have our vestibular sense and where the world is. And all of this creates a map of our body in our brain, so we know where our body is. And again, this is part of becoming embodied and self-aware. And so the right brain is the insula is the foundation of those areas of the cortex. And if that doesn't develop, then the rest of it will not develop appropriately.
So if that's true, Peter, do we know what the primary input is into the insular cortex?
Well, the primary input is going to be more of this visceral input coming in from our viscera. It's going into that area. So, our organ system afferently going in, and then also then the connections obviously back out to that area, to the areas that are stimulating. So definitely the viscera is going to be the main driver to the insulin.
Yeah, so we were just mapping that out this weekend, even more greater detail. There's something called the Central Autonomic Network, which is a newer network that, when we talk about where in the brain is the autonomic system represented, where is our organs, and where is the immune system perceived, right? So how do we know to activate our sympathetic or parasympathetic? We need to get some sensory type of signals. So it really starts with nerve endings in our organs and mostly travels up to the vagus nerve afferently into the nodose ganglion and then up into the nucleus tractus solitarius, and then the parabrachial nucleus, and then the hypothalamic pituitary into the locus ceruleus, the periaqueductal gray, the amygdala, the anterior cingulate, the orbital frontal, and the insula. And that's the connection up there. And then there's also a pathway that comes up through the spinal cord into the dorsal root ganglion, in through the spinothalamic tract or the anterolateral system through lamina 1, up into the thalamus, into the ventral basilar nucleus, and then also into the insula and into the parietal lobe. So that's where these connections kind of come from. And, we're outlining them even in more detail, and that's something we want to do even more research on.
Would it be fair to say, you mentioned the thalamus before as one of the great sensory integrators. Is there an analogous not relationship, but is the thalamus, does it serve the same role in terms of sensory input, say through kinesthesia or proprioception, as the insula would in terms of, say, visceroception, right? Peter was talking about the brain's awareness of the sensory input coming from our internal organs. Is there that analogous, or is that an analogous situation between the thalamus and the insular cortex, or are we talking at different levels in more complicated circuits?
No, it's pretty similar, actually. Meaning that, the thalamus, there are different nuclei that go into the insula, and that, go into the parietal lobe. And as I said, that insula borders all of that. Yeah. So some of the viscerotopic maps are more like in the temporal lobe, but again, we can localize, right? When you have stomach pain, I have stomach pain. That means you have to have a map in your brain, in your parietal lobe, that allows you to know somatotopically, this pain is coming from my stomach, or my heart is beating out of my chest right now, right? It's not necessarily the same as saying, I'm being touched here or there. It's not maybe as explicit that we were aware of it. It's more subconscious, and it's more almost, a gut feeling. It's intuitive. It's harder to put to words, which is all what you would expect with the right brain language, right? But it's really similar pathways that we would have for the rest of the somatotopic system and the somatotopic map that we see in our body. Yeah.
So we've described what interoception is, but I don't think we've offered like a discrete or a practical definition. So would it be fair to say that interoception at a very top level is the brain's awareness of everything that's happening inside the body?
Yeah, I think that, yes, on the internal part of our body, being able to feel, again, like I said, feeling if your stomach hurts, if your heart is beating, if you feel nervous, if you feel anxious, if you feel sick to your stomach, or if you just have this subconscious intuition that I shouldn't go there, that's dangerous. All of that is part of what I would look at as interoception.
Right. And so that's the umbrella category. There's different subcategories. Visceroception is one of those. In immunoception, Peter, I want to throw that over to you here in a second, but it occurred to me that as you were describing the circuitry going, say, from inside the body up through all these different structures to the insular cortex, it seems to me, especially as it relates to visceroception, that a lot of the focus and attention that's been placed on the vagus system or the vagal nerve, and trying to harness that as a therapy to improve autonomic control or anxiety states and, calm people down, all this kind of stuff. Are we really trying to access the insular cortex through the vagal system?
Yeah.
Is that really what we're trying to do?
So when you look at, where in the brain is the representation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? Where in the cortex, right? Again, hardly anybody has ever really talked about that. We don't think about it. We know there's brainstem mechanisms, but ultimately it comes into the brain, and somewhere in the cortex has to perceive it and then modify it. And that area, that primary area, is the insular cortex on either side. We believe the left side is more sympathetic, the right side is more parasympathetic. And ultimately, where the vagal afferents go into is into that. They ultimately end up in the insula, especially in the right insula. So therefore, again, just affecting the vagus nerve isn't affecting the brain's, again, it's like anything else. It's like saying, I want to affect something, a higher level skill, and I'm going to do it through basic nerve stimulation. There's some input, but ultimately it's the parasympathetic system. That's why it bugs us when we hear people saying, well, just stimulate the vagus nerve. It doesn't work that way. And then which one are you going to do? Are you going to do the right versus the left? Because that matters, right? So it's more complicated, and it ultimately does come down to that insula.
So, Peter, would you say that if someone's interest is to drive the vagal system, they'd be better off activating the insular cortex?
Yeah, I think that's where we're at. We're at this point where, we've played around with different types of vagal stimulators at different frequencies and a different anatomical relationship. And we haven't seen it have the proclaimed effect that others have, where we go in and we start obviously stimming. And I think part of it also too may be the fact that those people are not obviously driving it just from a developmental model. We're driving a developmental model. We're looking at, where some of the roadblocks are in the brainstem and the vestibular system and the cerebellum and its relationship to the lateralization. Because I think Dr. Miller brought up a good point earlier where, again, this idea that the brain is not only developing vertically, but it's also developing from a posterior to a frontal relationship. And it's also actually maturing from a medial to lateral relationship. So, and we look at, obviously that kind of like medial, maybe intermediate area of where the insular is talking about, and then around it that he was talking about that you can cut out is, obviously probably the posterior structures of the frontal lobe, where it meets the parietal lobe, but also, again, obviously the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And so, you look at those relationships and say, what we're finding out now is where when we're doing a bottom-up stimulation model of stimulating these networks, then we start able to come in and start doing top-down modulation, okay, with our other more sophisticated therapies. And so I think that's what we're finding out, that we could probably have a better effect on that network of the insular and the salience network that's part of that insular relationship through some of our top-down treatments, but it's superimposed on the bottom-up treatment that we did.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because the, in the brainstem there, where the primitive reflexes come from, is where the two primary or three primary nuclei of the autonomic system sit, right? So the dorsal motor nucleus, the rostroventral lateral medullary nucleus, which is the main nucleus for the sympathetic, and then the nucleus ambiguous. So, that's that whole polyvagal system that Porges has talked about. And so again, if those reflexes don't go away, that nucleus ambiguous and that parasympathetic nervous system, which has a lot to do with the feedback into that insula, ultimately as it grows up, doesn't mature. And so it prevents that maturation, and it prevents that development of that input into the insula and growing it, along with motor input and sensory input that grow all aspects of the brain. So that, that brainstem, and looking at those reflexes, if those reflexes are there, then the person has not had the optimal or appropriate development also of their autonomic system and that insula. Yeah. And again, so that's where a lot of this starts.
Yeah. And so, to create an analogy, if you have a home with a wall that's not on the right angle because the foundation underneath has cracked it, you can fix the wall over and over and over again. It's still going to go out of alignment, so to speak, until you fix the foundation.
Exactly.
So, Peter, when you were saying starting from the bottom up, you were talking identifying and then remediating these retained primitive reflexes. And then that is your foundational piece, and then moving up from back to front and then from medial to lateral is kind of a sequential process. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, because we start eliminating those primitive reflexes at the same time. We're also activating the vestibular nuclei and firing those vestibular pathways, because part of those primitive reflexes, our reflex, symmetrical tonic neck reflex, like labyrinth reflex, and Moreau reflex. These are reflexes that are also involved in vestibular functionality. And so a lot of times we see immature vestibular function. Then we also know we have immature muscle tone, so we're not getting that feedback, that sensory feedback from our muscles into our spinal cord, then traveling up to our cerebellum.
Yeah.
So, we know that the areas that are dependent on that input are not receiving that input. So we're talking about obviously the stimulation that's coming in, activating these experience-dependent genes to fire these particular or create these different connections in these variolobular areas, and they're dependent on that. So you have to fire the brain through its two primary systems, and firing it from a proprioceptive based scenario and a vestibular based scenario. And many times when you're actually doing the remediation of these primitive reflexes, you're doing activities that are actually firing those systems. Okay, so you are firing the proprioceptive system, and you're firing in the vestibular system. Now we're doing it probably more in an asymmetrical way, that we're looking at the asymmetrical presentation, because a lot of people again are looking at primitive reflexes more than ever, probably because of the awareness that Dr. Molo has brought to the topic over the last 20 years, and he does have the most published, the number one ranked paper in primitive reflexes in PubMed. So, and we know his papers are being referenced, but the bigger thing is the asymmetrical relationship of how we rehabilitate. And then the same way comes into how do we look at the asymmetrical difference in between one vestibular system versus the other vestibular, one cerebellum relationship to the other cerebellum. So that's how we're trying to drive up those systems. And then we're coming and stacking on top of that, or multimodal aspects of auditory input. Do we want to activate one auditory system versus the other? Do we want one visual system versus the other? How about somatosensory input? So we're going to do that, or olfactory stimulation. So we're going to look at that in terms of a laterality aspect. And as we do that, then we should start seeing this top-down maturation that's happening, and we're seeing the formation of these more sophisticated frontal striatal systems, the frontal pathways of the development of the frontal lobe, the orbital frontal area, the intermediate frontal lobe, the lateral frontal aspects, that are then going to drive down and fire and really put modulation on those different primitive aspects of the inhibiting those primitive reflexes, but also dampening the output of some of those deeper parts of the brain, like our limbic circuitry of our amygdala and our other structures that are in the anterior cingulate and so on. And also our basal ganglia, and being able to modulate the output of that basal ganglia so we're not getting overfiring, especially of that direct pathway that's producing these hyperkinetic type of movements, or these obsessive compulsive types of functions that we see from.
Yeah. You mentioned multimodal, and that's the nature and the essence of the insular cortex, right? It receives and transmits olfaction and gustatory sense, and auditory and visual and somatosensory and vestibular. It's got connections to the frontal lobe, and it almost seems like it is the central nexus, which makes sense. I mean, what you were saying about developmentally, the primitive reflexes and brainstem maturation drive the insular cortex, and that seems to drive development of all of the other cortical lobes, which makes total sense. We have been speaking as if right brain deficiency or decreased right brain development seems to be like the root of all evil. And that certainly is true in the autistic spectrum disorders. Aside from developmental issues that we would put on the spectrum, if we talk about the adult population and things like anxiety, depression, OCD, very common things that we see in clinical practice, does it still hold true that the right brain tends to need care? Or do we see an equal split between right brain and left brain? Or do we see mixed patterns where it's not the whole right brain or the whole left brain, it's a little bit on the left and a little bit on the right? Like, what's the spread and the diversity on the clinical presentation side?
Yeah, I think that, for when you look at it as a spectrum, like going from least severe to most severe, right? The least severe, there are just a little bit of accentuated asymmetries, right? But there's a little bit of a deficiency on one side, a little bit on a deficiency on the other, or we may have one side that's really dominating. And as we go down the road, I think we see more and more of these clear asymmetries where we have this deficit and overactivity. And so the right brain, again, when we talk about the root of a lot of autism and a lot of mental health issues, Alan Shore really describes this really good in his book. They're almost all right brain, but then also an accentuation of the right brain. So deficiencies, but accentuations are what's driving things like anxiety at a big level, social anxiety, fear, sense of danger, embarrassment, shame, guilt. The right brain generates sadness. The right brain generates embarrassment. The right brain generates fear. The left brain is happiness, is joy, is pride and anger, right? And aggressiveness and motivation, right? So when we have these right brain, like this guy I was just talking about, I mean, his right brain is out of control. He's been dyslexic his whole life. Again, he goes back to early childhood. All of his primitive reflexes were there. Very creative. He's an incredible athlete. He was a great artist. His dream when he was a kid was to be a stand-up comedian, right? So all of these things are there. Those are the traits that he's built on. But what happens is that right brain becomes overactive. It's hypersensitive. The insula and the anterior cingulate on the right in particular generate what's called the salience network. Mm-hmm. It basically says, it's like the early warning sign. Like, why are we going to be vigilant to something? Why are we looking at something? How do we pay attention? So the salience network says, this is important. Pay attention. And then it activates the attention network. And the right brain is overactive in kids with dyslexia. They pay too much attention to facial expressions. And it has this incredible effect on causing this dramatic stress response in their body. And it can be overwhelming. Like they're too aware and they don't know any different. This has been as they've been since the beginning of their life. And so they feel like they're being judged by others and they feel they have low self-esteem, even though they may be incredibly talented and creative and have great abilities. So, the overactive right, these are people that will kill themselves because they feel such hopelessness, such depth of sadness, shame and guilt. So, lack of joy and happiness with overwhelming sadness combined with guilt and shame, that's the definition of major depressive disorder. Yeah, and that's what it is.
Recipe for disaster.
And that is bipolar disorder, where you get overactive on that right, where schizophrenia is, overactive on the left. So the right brain, though, from a standpoint of being deficient and how it affects that insula, or overactive, where you're too connected to your body, you're too connected to your emotions, you're in such emotional pain, or you're so hypersensitive to other people's emotions, that also is devastating. And we see this epidemic of anxiety right now. And a lot of it is driven by that overactive right brain.
Interesting. So I know that you're a detail-oriented person. Have you tracked stats in your clinics, or do you have a sense of what the relative dominance is of a right brain deficiency versus an overactive right brain?
Well, if we look at just the statistics out there right now, obviously autism, ADHD, OCD, Tourette's, and tics is increasing dramatically, right? We know that, it's epidemic rise. But we also see the anxiety is the number one mental disorder amongst people. And a lot of that is driven by overactive right brain. And we know that the number one, disability of all is really learning disabilities, and in particular dyslexia, which affects almost 20% of the whole population. So both of them are pretty big. It kind of like anything else, Steve. It's like, what do you attract into your practice, right? Yeah. But it's pretty equal, although, working with children and looking at who's going to seek out that type of care. The parents of kids with right brain deficits are usually become aware of it much earlier. And especially, we're working with very severe kids that aren't speaking. And, so that is, the people that are going to be most desperate right off the bat, seek help right away and travel from all over the world. So our practice, the majority of it is in that area. Yeah. But there is an equal amount of people walking around with that big right brain issue and is really struggling.
And
So
Steve,
is
that's personally for me. I mean, that's been my life. My early developmental delay was a learning disability, and wasn't able to read, but yet I was a good athlete, but always been very over probably sensitive and hypersensitive to people's emotions and tone of voice, and what people perceive of me. Or, am I good enough? Again, going back to your earlier vision myself, achieving what I've achieved at this point professionally. Probably early on in my life, probably not. Probably wasn't something that, in my third grade, fourth grade, when I was in special ed classes and being made fun of and all the time. And then my escape was, obviously, playing sports, but the struggle was real and devastating for many years with the difficulty with reading and learning. And I think more than anything, as that somehow, through just the luck of what my mom did for me, somehow kicked my left brain in and got my left brain to develop by the time I was like in 7th and 8th grade. But it's always been something that, I've had to be very hyper aware in my 20s and even now, that I still have to stimulate my left brain at times, because my salience can really, really take over and sometimes drive, some almost like manic behaviors, in the sense of like what Dr. Miller refers to, those bipolar aspects. You can get really sad, and you can get really, and especially when I lost my dad, 20 some odd years ago, tough time in my life to deal with that, and really not try to like completely withdraw from everything. So this is a real thing. And I think, like Dr. Miller says, that, you have, 20% of the population of children that have learning disability, but no one's associating everything else that they're dealing with, the anxiety or the, maybe being very introverted and not really wanting to be, even though they socially can, but you want to be withdrawer because of that left brain, overactive right brain, sorry, and you don't want to you don't have that approach behavior that you want to go towards people. So that's a big thing, is that I don't think anybody's put that relationship together other than for Dr. Malolo to say that, hey, these learning disabilities are one thing, but the bigger thing might be, what comes down in terms of depressive and these higher forms of social anxiety.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's made that leap yet, other than him.
Is it always the case that a dominance pattern is caused by a deficiency of the opposite hemisphere?
Yeah, I believe that's the general reason. So, when I was first looking at this, Steve, and again, there's a lot of different things out there, and people like, talking about whether it's overactivity causing symptoms or underdevelopment, or what's the chicken, what's the egg, right? So when you look at the attention research out there that's been out there for years, and it's probably more studied than anything else, they looked at that and they were saying that, it's kind of like this flashlight thing, meaning both sides of the hemispheres, shine light on the opposite world, right? And pay attention to it. And so they were saying that, it looks like, where our attention is drawn too much to one side of the world and away from the other. And that's what we call neglect syndromes, right? So, they were saying, well, is it overactivity of the attention network, or is it an underdevelopment or injury to the other attention network, which causes that one to overcompensate? And what the literature clearly showed is that it was initiated by the underactivity of one side, or the underdevelopment or the injury. And so the underdevelopment is what initiates it. And then that promotes the overactivity. And then the overactivity becomes a problem. And, and we address both. So both sides are a problem. People have misconstrued my work and say, well, he's only working on one side of the brain or the other. No, we're always working on both sides of the brain. But we're focusing it primarily on the deficit. But now we have new tools that developed over the past 10 or 12, 15 years that we can do things to actually dampen the brain in a safe and effective way. Things like transcranial direct current, or alternating current, or magnetic, or using lasers in a particular way, where we can actually then both dampen and activate. And when you're dealing with the real severe issues, when you're dealing with higher functioning things and things that are, kind of milder imbalances, just activate the underactive side is enough to cause that to inhibit the other side and drive it down. But when you're dealing with something like autism, where they're stimming constantly and everything they're doing is feeding that left brain, or someone with so much anxiety where their thoughts are so perseverative on all of the negative fear or whatever, that it's unless you can dampen that, it may not release the imbalance. It's almost impossible to overcome that. And so we've been able to really inhibit things, and that was one of the reasons why I really developed that with Kevin James when he spoke on Joe Rogan about how I helped his daughter. That was one of the things that really we were developing that and allowed us to get rid of those horrible tics that she developed because of that, not only stimulating that right brain, but really driving down that left to be able to allow that right brain to arise up. But the initiator is always the deficit that leads to the overactivity, but both of them become problematic. Both of them become symptomatic, and we need to address both when we're looking to resolve these issues.
Yeah. I was just thinking more on the metabolic side that if you have a very significant asymmetry, let's say it's a left brain dominant, right brain deficient situation, increased rates of neuronal activity demand higher energy utilization. And it seems to me that these situations would almost be self-perpetuating, that a dominant left brain would utilize, say, more than 50% of the energy supply, which would leave the right brain, which needed stimulation and needs energy for that stimulation to work. It would leave it at a deficit, and you're almost locked into this pattern, which becomes self-perpetuating. Would that be an accurate statement from how you guys see it?
Yeah, and then if you try to treat it and you do everything equally to both sides, that hyperactive side is going to pick up on it quicker than the other side. And so it actually creates more of an imbalance. This is what no one seems to understand, that, and that's why everybody's like, well, don't you have to work on both sides? No, if you work on that side, that's already everything they do is constantly stimulating that. And now you feed into that more. Yeah. Is there maybe a deficiency on that side? Yes. But it's, and that's why, if you don't do modalities in a directed way, directed to increase one side and decrease the other, and you just work to stimulate both sides, you end up stimulating the overactive side more. And that further inhibits the other side, and it actually creates more of an imbalance. And so, that's how most therapists are trained, even as chiropractors, adjust one side, adjust the other. You spin them in one side, you spin them in the other. You stimulate one side, you stimulate, just by changing that and only directing it, the increased stimulus to one and the decrease on the other, that changes everything. And it's for exactly what you just said.
Yeah. So just to pick up on, you said like DC current, transcranial stimulation, would it be, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head as we're going through the conversation, you're using some kind of a DC direct current stimulation. If you wanted to inhibit one part of the brain, let's say on the left, you would put the reference lobe over a specific Brodmann area.
Right, the cathode, the negative.
And then you would put the other electrode on the right side over a Brodmann area that you want to activate. Would that be a rough approach?
Yep, the anode. The red lead goes over the side you want to activate, over a particular Brodmann area that we want to activate. And then usually on the exact same other side, we're using the cathode and this is literally how it works. And there's a lot of research that has proven that it actually drives and more hyperpolarizes one side and depolarizes the other. And it literally can be used to help induce a balance, but that's a top-down effect.
Yeah.
So if you're not working on the bottom up at the same time, right, then you may have an effect, but that effect will only be temporary.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me throw a caveat there. Anybody who's listening, don't just go buy a DC unit and stick it on your brain and turn the dials.
Right.
Like there are specific protocols that these docs have developed that make it safe and effective. So that's just my public service announcement right there, Peter.
Well, what I was going to say is that bottom-up interference is what Dr. Mull is really alluding to. That idea that when we have the retained primitive reflexes, or we have the immaturity in the vestibular system, or the immaturity in the cerebellum, we just have this tremendous interference that's happening, and we're not getting that higher level of lateralization and specificity of those lobes that we've been talking about. Okay,
Yeah.
and we're not getting that maturation of posterior to frontal mechanism. When we're doing everything, we just have this very specific developmental blueprint that Dr. Mull has created over the years that takes us through these longitudinal processes and relating it to where we have a vertical development, we have a horizontal development, and then we have an integrative model. So I think that, again, sometimes that's lost in how people view his model.
Yeah. I want to ask you guys about cold plunges, but let me do a time check here. We're at an hour and 3/4. We haven't even talked about immunoception yet. So I'm good to stay on. We can either finish the conversation if you guys don't have a hard time limit, or maybe we could do a part 3. It's up to you.
Yeah,
How do you guys want to handle it?
You want to do a part 3?
Yeah, I think a part 3 would be good. I think we've gotten a lot of stuff, but this is also a lot for people. And and it might overwhelm people there, and I think leaving them for, more, I think would be good. And then we can do a part 3 and really get into that.
Yeah.
Because this is great. You're doing a great job, Steve. You're really bringing up a lot of things. You're really
great. I appreciate it. So let me throw this one out as the last question. There's with things like cold plunges, which of course is like the new shiny toy that everyone talks about and does. And I haven't heard anyone talk about it from a neurological perspective, certainly not an interoceptive perspective. It's usually, heat shock proteins and, maybe some immunological impacts. But because the insular cortex deals with, thermal sense, and my understanding is that cooling will activate the insular cortex more than heating will. It seems to me that perhaps one of the primary mechanisms that cold plunges can be beneficial for people with autonomic issues, with autoimmune issues, with psychiatric issues, is this relationship of I get in really cold water, it's painful, it's uncomfortable, but it's going to drive my insular cortex. And from there, I get this, even though it's going to be bilateral, I still get this increased ability to govern and control things.
Right.
Have you guys looked at cold plunging from that perspective? I mean, I know it sounds good on paper, but are you guys using and leveraging that in practice, or are you doing things like I actually did something myself because I was doing some literature review today, and I was listening to Mozart's Sonata K488 in my left ear, and I had my left hand in a bucket of ice water while I was doing some work.
Yeah.
And the intent was to bias the thermal, basically it was a left-sided cold plunge, but just with my hand. My rationale was, if you look at the somatosensory cortex and the sensory homunculus, you have more representation in your hand than you do, say, in your core. So I thought, well, I don't have a cold plunge, so I'll just stick my hand in a bucket of ice water and I will listen to Mozart. And that's been studied. That particular sonata has been used in studies on treatment for schizophrenia with success, and the link is increased insular. But the paper and the research didn't seem to be designed for laterality. So I, had in my headphones, I took my right earbud out, so I listened to it through my left ear, had my right hand. Not that I think that I have any right insular cortex. I just wanted to see what happened. And I was just kind of casually watching my iWatch and checking my heart rate. And sure enough, my heart rate starts to come down a little bit. I feel this sense of relaxation. Anyways, just kind of spitballing and trying to synthesize all this information. But the question is about cold plunges and insular cortex activation. And could it be lateralized kind of like the way that I was doing it? Does that make sense?
Yep, and I'll give you an example of it. So this isn't just theoretical. It's when looking at the idea, all of this, and the idea of self-awareness and using as a model the neglect syndrome, hemi-neglect syndromes, which is a loss of body ownership, right? And that is related to right parietal strokes. So strokes that involve the inferior parietal lobule, which is Brodmann area 39 and 40, which is where our primary area for a lot of proprioceptive input come from. We know when there's strokes there, people may lose the perception of the left side of space. And again, this is when we see these attentional mechanism shifts where they only see the right side of the world. They literally don't see the left. So there's a lot of different studies looking at things like, TENS unit on the left side of the neck, vibration from the left side of the body, optokinetic stimulation. But there was always studies looking at cold caloric irrigation of the left ear. And it always threw me off because I was like, cold caloric irrigation from the left ear should inhibit the right parietal lobe, not activate it, right? But yet it was one of the best things for bringing back body ownership. And so I thought about it and said, and then once I started really understanding and looking at the insula, I said, okay, the effect isn't the caloric irrigation of the inner ear. It's the cold in the inner ear that is activating the right insula, which is actually giving body ownership and actually reducing the neglect syndrome. It's the cold that's doing it, because otherwise, based on what we know, putting cold water in. And one of the things that was a key phrase in the research was that it was done below the level of nystagmus.
Ah.
So it wasn't doing it to the point where it actually created nystagmus. So it wasn't an actual inner ear vestibular effect.
Yeah.
So what was it? It was a cold effect.
It was thermal. Yeah.
And so that's where, when we talk about, again, people say cold is stimulating the vagal system. What do you mean? So I do believe that is more that if you use a cold plunge, it's more lateralized to the right. It's more activating the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic. And that's why your heart rate went down. And that if you do it to the left side, it's going to have even a more lateralized and more specific effect.
Yeah.
And that is something that we do sometimes use as a modality like that. Although, again, it's kind of hard to get a kid and force them to put their hand in cold water or hot water. But many of them don't even feel that. They don't even feel it. I mean, I had a kid recently that the parents were saying that we know they don't feel hot and cold. And that's a deficit of the right insula. And they said, they did something in class where this is like a 5-year-old kid, and where they were having these kids, hold ice cubes in their hand and put it in warm water. And this one little girl was holding on to the ice cube and she wouldn't let go of it. She kept on holding on to it and holding on, where the other kids couldn't hold it anymore. She didn't want to let go of it, and she never did until it melted. Wow. And she's not even perceiving it. And that's something we see all the time. And that's a basic question we ask.
Yeah. I know in our world, like, we all have miracle stories, but I have a very short, cool story of using cold calorics and resolved a case of cortical blindness.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Well, again, it'd be interesting to know if that cortical blindness was partly a neglect syndrome, and maybe a visual neglect, and that, by using the cold, you activated and created more integration in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, 20 odd years ago. So I don't remember all the specifics of the case, but
yeah, that's pretty wild.
Yeah. Nevertheless. All right. So we're resolved to do a part 3.
Absolutely.
Maybe there's going to be a part 5 somewhere along the way.
Maybe. If there's a demand, why not?
That's right.
That'd be
Absolutely.
great, because we are working on multiple immunological pathways right now and trying to get some papers written. So I'm sure we'll have plenty.
Yeah. So, I mean, even if the, part 4, part 5 are 6 months apart, that's pretty cool. I'd love to have you guys back. This quality and this level of conversation, I think, is unusual for the podcast world, right?
Absolutely.
So, I truly respect and admire and appreciate your expertise and certainly your time. Any parting words of wisdom before we hop off and then furiously text each other to figure out when the next conversation is going to happen.
I think from the very beginning, you mentioned that very few people really understand functional neurology and really don't understand the brain. And that's what prevents them from really doing that. And I think this was a demonstration of that. All of these terms, all of these pathways, all of these neuroanatomical locations and things, we use them fluently as part of our language. This is what we do. Yeah. And this, to me, is really the essence of what functional neurology should be. The understanding of that. And if you don't have that level of knowledge of the brain, then, you really have to be careful what you're saying, the different comments, the limitations you put on treatment, telling people that you can't get that better when you really don't know what the problem is. But, this is a good demonstration of, we're not saying these phrases to impress people. This is how we talk. This is what we do.
It's the language.
Yeah, this is it. We can, I don't know any other way to actually think of it.
Yeah.
I think that's great, because I think what we've always said, and especially when we did our New York courses this past year, we talked about how, Rob was probably teaching them French and I was teaching them German. Simultaneously, we were layering neurology and this very sophisticated anatomical language of neurology, and the way we did it and the way we taught it. And I think that's where, for our clinicians out there that really want to probably up their game, I do highly recommend that they maybe participate in taking the 10 courses that we taught that are available online now, because we really did, I think, probably the best we've ever done, and the best I've ever seen Dr. Miller do it. But we put it together in such an orderly way that you can go from one course to the next and see how we taught developmental neuroscience and then developmental immunology in a very, a sequential way.
Yeah, and I also have a neuroanatomy course for that reason as well, too, advanced neuroanatomy, clinical neuroanatomy. But, I was just in Germany. I was lecturing to a large group of chiropractors in Dusseldorf, and it was a great organization, a great group, and whatever. And one of the things that one of the doctors was saying is that they were really excited because their goal was to bring, make sure that, they had world-class chiropractic and healthcare in Germany, right? And so, when I did my lecture, the first thing I talked about, well, if you want to bring world-class chiropractic, you have to be world-class, right? And you have to know this stuff at a world-class level. That's where it starts. You can't just sit back and go, we want to bring it to that. No, you have to do it. You have to learn it. If you want to be great, if you want to be world-class, then you need to learn the information and be fluent with it that way. And that's all there is to it,
And we'll leave it at that. What's the website where docs can go if they want to learn more about the training courses?
drrobertmalillo.com. We can sign up for the courses there. There's information on them if they go to the website. Under courses, there's a lot of information. And and it's all there. It's all online at this point as well.
All right, Rob, Peter, guys, thank you so much. And I'll be in touch soon. We'll schedule part 3.
All right, Steve. Great. Thank you.
All right, you guys have a great night.